If we talk about the Vincent, can you talk a little bit more about the Vicente Fox? What was the project? What were the dynamics? Why did it fail? How did you come back?
Sure. Well, I remember I don't visit Bangladesh that often, but every year or two now. But when I was on a rickshaw in Bangladesh, and it was just when cell phones were coming in, and a friend and Grameen Foundation supporter called me and said Vicente Fox was just elected president of Mexico. And he had, among kind of rising star politicians in the world at that time, he was one of the ones who really had most deeply got Grameen Bank. So everyone was saying, well, how do we take advantage of this? This is one of the critical countries in the developing world, 100 million population, backdoor of the United States. And so how do we capitalize on his interest? And there was a fairly long kind of period between the election and the swearing in. So Dr. Yunus said, Alex, redouble your efforts and figure out something big to do with the Fox administration in Mexico. So we were a fairly small organization at the time, but I joined with one of my board members, and we went repeatedly to Mexico to try to, and what we decided we were going to start a kind of a wholesale lending facility for microfinance in Mexico. Which was modeled on something Professor Yunus started in Bangladesh. Actually, he started it to basically help finance his competition, which says something about what he's really about, which was about a thriving microfinance sector, not Grameen, beating its competitors, because they were all trying to do the same thing. We didn't do that good a job liaisoning with the existing microfinance sector, so a lot of the things I would do now in terms of touching the bases and stroking egos, we didn't do. So that we were seen as the invading force, trying to, from US or Bangladesh, but not Mexico. And thirdly, that when we were at a critical point in the project, 9/11 happened, and basically the private sector financing that was going to be the linchpin and attract other financing fell apart. So you put those together, and probably we also stuck with the project longer than we should have cut our losses earlier when it just seemed to be, and perhaps lastly, should have gone through more of a quiet phase in the project that we would do now, than be fairly publicly exposed before we had a lot of there and a real alignment between the partners. So those were, and ultimately we brought one of Dr. Yunus's top deputies out for 6 weeks to work on it, and yet in the end, no such fund, no such organization was ever launched, and probably kind of the reputation of Grameen Foundation and Grameen was, at least for a time, kind of set back in the Mexican market.
And it sounds like what brought you through was, as you were talking about before, the promise that got you into this, which had full potential in that hadn't diminished in any way.
Right, and also I just have a kind of a faith in my own ability and people that I work with to just, as painful as it can be to have gotten so close in some ways to a result. I think I have an inherent faith in my own ability to incorporate learnings and emerge stronger for the next project, succeed or fail, and try to attract people while they may not have all the professional training and that someone else may have, that they may or should have for a position. That they're basically resilient people who are kind of visionaries, but also able to execute better in every cycle because they have honest kind of deconstructions of what went right and what went wrong. And yeah, for me, ultimately, the vision, the pain of poverty and the reality of solutions to poverty that are limited only because of our lack of imagination, that remains strong through even the worst setbacks.
Clearly, Grameen Foundation is quite established today. You mentioned that you started with $6,000 seed money. In a way, you started your own business, but what I think maybe made it even more difficult is that you didn't have the returns to promise investors that a for-profit business has. So how are you able to do it?
Well, I think ultimately one solution was, one approach was just to talk to a lot of people. And there were certainly many who said, and some literally, come back in a year. If you're still if you're still around in a year, maybe I'll do something, but you got to find someone else to get you there. But a few said, I'm willing to place a bet on you with my time, with my connections, with my money, and so there was just a matter of the more you talk to, the more you're going to find in both categories. And so it was just getting out there. And I think second thing was just learning to draw people in and have people feel, and I mean the early staff and board, that this was part of their problem to solve. How do you get this from barely surviving to being a thriving organization? Trying to get them to care as much about it as I did. And that number grew over time. And I think ultimately there needs to be a leap of faith. You need to have the courage of your convictions that this can be a great organization without much evidence. I'll give you two examples. There was when we were negotiating what was the first $1 million grant we received that we were primarily going to be the implementers of. We'd gotten one before, but we subcontracted most of it. And I was asked by the philanthropist to say, can you deliver what is in this draft proposal? And I said, I thought about it for a second, and I said, yes. I said, we will find a way to. And I had never delivered on something that aggressive without my resources in my life. But I said, ultimately, if I'm unwilling to say something close to yes, I don't really deserve that type of someone placing a bet on me in our organization. So ultimately, there's not a lot of ground between yes and no, and I chose yes, with the evidence being my commitment and the fact that I'd risen to challenges before, though none of that size. I also remember when I was negotiating a loan for a Grameen organization, but we were the lead negotiators, and I was asked at a critical moment to ask how much money was needed, and it turned out it was $10.6 million. And so here I was, basically saying I'm negotiating for an amount of money that probably I will never earn that amount of money in my entire life, my salary over the whole of my working life, and yet I was asking this person, here I was 31 years old, for that, and I had a decision to make. Was I going to ask it with apology, hesitatingly? That sends a message. Or do you ask for it just matter of fact? This project needs $10.6 million. That's what we're looking for. And in that split second, I did it, confidently and without hesitation. And those are two in my mind, but ultimately, I think those minute-by-minute decisions where you're conveying, and people are continuously, as I learned, assessing you as a social entrepreneur, not looking at your balance sheet, though they do that too, but looking at, is this someone who is going to make things happen? Will make their mistakes, but is ultimately going to make them happen, and are they a fundamentally ethical person? And that is, and ultimately, helping people answer those questions and not worrying about, do we have a brochure that's too glossy or not glossy enough or whatever. Ultimately, that's what people are taking the measure of, and there are many opportunities when you're in a startup phase, especially, to reinforce that you do make things happen and that you are ethical or that you're not. And those are and again, this is me thinking backwards about what made the critical difference, being in analytical mode, but it really rings true for me.